So yeah, I'm Chris Warren Dickens, psychotherapist, originally from the UK, dragged over here to the US by my husband, where I now live in Ridgewood, with my two daughters, our two daughters, and I have a psychotherapy practice here in Ridgewood as well. Sandy, do you want to introduce yourself, and Mike?
I'm Sandy Johnson. I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I have a private practice in Midland Park where I work with children, adolescents, families, and adults. And I also am a part-time clinical supervisor in full-service community schools in Paterson, New Jersey. It's good to be here.
Hello, everyone. My name is Michael Tozzoli. I'm the CEO at West Bergen Mental Health Care. I'm really happy to be back here tonight. It is in some ways old home week. We've been doing these Wednesday nights for a couple of years now, and I find each one to be a little deeper and a little more interesting. Tonight is going to be a really interesting one as a couple of colleagues come together and share some thoughts. So I am really happy to be here. It's nice to see some familiar names and some familiar faces, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I guess I should show the book. That's Beyond the Blue. This is the book I wrote recently and it's just been published. Today is really for me to explain why I wrote the book and briefly what's in it and why there's also more work to be done. So what I'm going to do is read extracts from the book and pause each time and let Sandy and Michael jump in with any thoughts they might have. I have a website, it's chriswarrendickens.com if you want to buy the book or if you want to read about the project. Just bear in mind my surname, Dickens, is spelled I-N-S, D-I-C-K-I-N-S, not E-N-S. I also want to just flag a caveat that this is a conversation about the book and issues that arise from it. This is not meant to be informal mental health advice in any way. We may be covering topics that might trigger you in some way. We may be discussing things that are difficult for you. If that's the case, if you have any questions, please contact your clinician or your doctor. And obviously, if you're in urgent need of help, always call 911 or take yourself to the nearest emergency room or the nearest hospital. So my book, Beyond the Blue, what's it all about? Well, it's a bit of a play on words. Beyond the blue of the male label and beyond the blue of depression, anxiety, relationship conflict, and trauma. I wrote this book, it was really accumulation of many years of getting to this point. When I was a child, my uncle died by suicide when we were living in Hong Kong. And for years, that kind of set me on a path of wanting to help people, eventually becoming a therapist myself. And I carried out qualitative research into male experiences of suicidal thoughts and experiences of counseling. And that was in 2010 when I did the research. Many years later, still facing some of the same issues that I found out in that research. And one of the biggest things is men don't talk. That's the sort of kind of one liner that I've always taken away. And this isn't a talk today about pathologizing men or saying that there's something wrong with them, but trying to understand how we got into this situation where there are such high rates of suicide and trauma and other unhealthy behaviors, and yet such low rates of male labeled people seeking help. I see it in my practice every day. People who come to me who are male labeled, they're usually pushed into it. Maybe they're pushed into it by a wife or a girlfriend or a partner, or they're here with their arms folded saying, I don't really need this. It's actually someone else who needs it. So again, I'm not pathologizing the male labeled person, but I want to understand what's going on here. And one of the things I cover in my book is this myth that the male-labeled are somehow not vulnerable, or they don't suffer from depression, or anxiety is not a male thing, it's a female thing. And these are all myths that have developed over time. To be honest, I thought they were dying away, but I've found them coming up a lot, particularly as a parent. I hear it a lot in schools, these myths being propagated, and that troubles me. I see these sort of messages passed on to the next generation. No matter how kind of aware we claim to be as adults, we're still saying certain things that close off doors to people who may carry the male label. So this book is to kind of address the obstacles in the way of getting mental health care. As a therapist, I want to know if people are not coming to my office, or if they're not able to even spot the issues that bring them to a therapist. So the male label, I say in this book, is a big obstacle to mental health care. Secondly, there's other obstacles, such as the interaction of that male label with other parts of a person's identity. So maybe that they have a certain gender identity or sexuality that causes problems for them trying to get the correct type of help, mental health care help. So if you have the male label as an obstacle to mental health care, and then you add in other parts of that person's identity, including things like racism that they may encounter with diagnosing mental health care professionals, and then you add on a pandemic, you got a really worrying kind of situation where people are just not getting the help that they need to. So during the pandemic, I pushed out, I finished off this book where I wanted to provide accessible help for people, first of all, identifying things like depression, anxiety, relationship conflict, and trauma. And secondly, an opportunity for them to think about, how is my male label helping me or hindering me in terms of awareness of these mental health issues and getting the right type of help. And then thirdly, very briefly giving some kind of survival tools for them to be able to survive and thrive despite things like depression, anxiety, relationship conflict, and trauma. I was also well aware that a book is not going to solve a lot of those issues. And often things like depression is a lifelong struggle. So I also included a chapter where it helps you to work out how to identify the right type of help. So how to separate the good from the bad and ugly, professional help, and where to get that. Sandy and Mike, do you have any questions so far? Do you have anything you want to kind of add in to any of that?
Yeah, you know, Chris, one of the things that we were seeing at West Bergen Mental Health Care, which was an unintended surprise, was that with the advent of teletherapy, we saw a larger number of men making the call and coming in. And right. So whether that was because of sort of severity or just the intensity of COVID, we have a theory, and I'm just going to throw it out there, wondering, given your book and certainly your research, some of our team was also thinking that teletherapy is less stigmatizing. You're not driving to West Bergen Mental Health Care and parking in a parking lot and checking in at the front desk and sitting in this admittedly, hopefully comfortable waiting room, but it's a big waiting room, right? And there's, there's like Sam from, Midland Park is over there, and Gina from, there's this sort of this sense of community where you're able to log on, do your therapy, and log out. We saw an absolute pop in the number of the target for your book, where they simply, prior to COVID, were not coming into a place like West Bergen.
Sure.
Thoughts? Did you have any thoughts on that?
I think that's definitely an important factor. I think sometimes there's the trouble with the new trends is it goes like this and then it goes like that, and then we're back to the same old patterns. And I think there's a longer term issue about how we condition people and how we respond to people who carry the male label that's not gonna be solved by just telehealth. But that is definitely one factor that maybe to think about, that maybe make that more available. So we do encourage more people of any label to get mental health care.
Yeah, I'll tell you, we were excited. We were genuinely, yeah, go team. Finally, right? Guys are coming in. There's a process of that. And so very, very interesting. It's a good point, Chris, really good point.
And you know, it's interesting, Michael, just to throw that in there. I work with Michael. Most of you probably know me, Barbara Hand. I think one of the things we also as a team thought is that it was a little bit destigmatizing in the sense that men, or the male label, those who associate with the male label, could easily do teletherapy without letting anybody else know. So for example, you could say, I'm going into my office, my home office, and having a work Zoom, when in fact you were maybe conducting a therapy session. So you were able to do it in a way that you didn't have to let anybody else know what you were doing. And perhaps that made it a little bit easier for them to go into that process.
Excellent point. Yes, agreed.
I also want to just clarify, in the book, I use the term male labeled as opposed to men. And I just want to clarify that I'm discussing the obstacle of the male label that was given at birth, the sex label, that we have associations between that male label and our access to mental health and our responses to our emotions. Obviously, I'm not. Obviously, people are, have a certain gender identity that may not ascribe to that original sex label. So that's important to kind of clarify that we're talking about anyone who was given the male sex label at birth, even if as they grow up, they don't identify it because they're genderqueer or non-binary or trans, but they still were given that problem in the first place. Like over the years, they've had to struggle with this male label, which people sometimes only see when someone's seeking help. And perhaps I just want to just expand on that a little bit, that when people seek help, sometimes even healthcare professionals pathologize the male labeled. They kind of see them as angry or aggressive, and they don't necessarily see beneath the behavior, and they don't see the depression or the trauma that might be fueling that behavior. So this book is important to give help to people who are the male labeled, who have been given that male label, even if they don't want it. But it's also an awareness exercise for the healthcare professionals or anybody who deals with people who are male labeled, to look beneath that behavior, beneath that anger, aggression, tendency to overwork out. What are the kind of underlying unmet needs underneath that behavior? So I was going to read an extract, but Sandy, you looked like you were just about to say something.
I was just going to say, I think, Chris, the expectation that goes along with the male label of the things that, like, you know, not supposed to cry.
Yeah.
Can't be a tattletale, have to stand up for yourself. This, I think in your book, you'd call it the strong silent type. Those things that go along with that create this expectation that I think from a very young age, because I treat very young children that are male labeled children, recognize there's an expectation and kind of, you know.
Perhaps I'll jump into chapter 2 extract. I know I did tell Sandy and Michael I was going to read other parts, but it seems more relevant to go with this extract. Is that okay with you?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, all right.
Sure. Sure.
So this fits in with what we're discussing. It's in chapter 2, the conditioning associated with the male label. We don't notice the black swans of the depressed male label because of the way we are conditioned. Actually, sorry, I'm going to read the other bit first because that doesn't make sense. It's in chapter 2, the black swans of the depressed male label. If you only expect a white swan, you will never see the black ones. And so when people only expect the depressed to be withdrawn or tearful, that is all they see. The people who are depressed, those around them, and the healthcare professionals who are supposed to help them do not recognize the anger or irritation, the overworking, the incessant need to perform as symptoms of the beast of depression. And so the large, dark underbelly of underreported cases of depression swells and grows fatter, and those in need of help are left to suffer alone. The majority of this dark underbelly of underreported cases is due in part to a societal myth that the male labeled do not suffer from depression. This is simply not true, and yet I have encountered therapists, psychiatrists, and doctors who continue to perpetuate the myth. They focus on the surface behavior of their male labeled clients, and instead of trying to understand the depression fueling that behavior, they refer dismissively to their male labeled clients as narcissists, sociopaths, or examples of toxic masculinity. I've even heard these professionals say, without any sort of scientific justification, that the male labeled are inherently unable to experience emotions in the same way as the female labeled. And some professionals claim that the male labeled are inherently violent and aggressive. There is a higher rate of diagnosis of the male labeled when it comes to externalizing disorders such as oppositional defiant disorder, conduct disorder, and other such diagnoses. Some argue such diagnoses are given to the male labeled at a higher rate because the male label blinds the diagnosing healthcare professionals to other potential diagnoses such as depression. It's also arguable that due to the racism, transphobia, biphobia, or homophobia of the diagnosing healthcare professional, this issue is compounded when we consider a person's identity beyond the blue of their male label. So examples could be transphobia or racism stopping the person from getting the help they need. Did you want me to read on, or did you want to have any comments about that?
I think this is a really important, because I think, Chris, when I even first met you, we talked about how some people even are unwilling to go get help because it's actually, there's a danger surrounding that, right?
Right.
So, and you had an interesting experience with that when you were working in London. But, in certain family systems, in certain cultures, and, it's just unacceptable.
Sure.
Or I hear a lot of, we don't believe in therapy.
And I think that some people do genuinely believe that that isn't for their boys or their husbands, that that's not something that they kind of need, that they need something else. I'm just going to read the next extract, if that's okay. We also don't notice the black swans of the depressed male label because of the way we are conditioned. All of us, no matter our label, are taught certain things about the male label. Some examples of what we are taught explicitly or implicitly include: we expect the male label to be silent and strong, and thus not admit to vulnerabilities. Depression is the king of vulnerabilities, and so shame silences you. The male labeled are expected to focus outwards on external gain and power, not inwards on emotions and thoughts. As a result, you may be aware that what you suffer is depression. The male labeled are expected to remain independent, and so seeking help for something like depression is an admission of defeat. As a result, fewer male labeled are likely to access mental health care for depression, and so the myth continues that the male labeled are somehow untouched by the deep beast of depression. Due to structural inequality, the problem of a lack of access to mental health care by the male labeled is compounded when we consider how the male label intersects with a person's identity, for example, their racial or ethnic identity, true gender identity, or sexuality. As the United States is a patriarchal society, this conditioning influences the dominant view of emotions. The approach preferred by many with power or authority is to focus outwards on achievement and power. Depression, anxiety, and trauma are all rather inconvenient truths that many people would rather not hear about.
Absolutely. Absolutely, Chris. One of the things that resonates for me when I'm hearing you describe in terms of clients with the male label, I'm struck when I see folks in my practice, male labeled, typically men, they're shocked when you start to describe and even ask questions about what their inner life is like. What's
Right.
that? What does that
Yeah.
look like? And I usually sort of ask them to describe or at least rate for me their own inner experience versus what
Right.
they look like on the outside world. Is it this close together or this far apart or this far apart? And just the very exercise of them doing that is often shocking to them. I find that just the process of needing to sort of reflect on that can be shocking. But for folks where it's this far apart, all the issues that you've articulated so clearly in your reading and your writing come up, and then you suddenly are talking about their inner space and their inner world and the outside world as well, and what their perception. And there's often a deer caught in headlights type feeling for me as a clinician, where they're really caught off guard by the conversation. It ultimately leads, if the therapy works, it ultimately leads to incredible depth and can be just brilliant work for them. But at the beginning, overwhelming and scary and just shocking.
And you're mentioning overwhelming and scary, and I think Sandra also mentioned about fear, but there's also a part of our work where they don't really buy into it. They think, well, it's indulgent, it's a waste of time, I've got bills to pay, why am I looking inwards when I've got so much else to do? Especially with the pandemic, it's almost like a vicious cycle that they need more help during a pandemic, and yet they need to also kind of get back out there. And this is what I called in the book the fear of selfing, like the kind of fear of or the ickiness with selfing, that we use these terms which maybe we should rebrand, that things like self-esteem, self-compassion, self-care, self-awareness. And I think that kind of jars with some people.
Yeah. Well, do you think that because it often comes from a place of being misinterpreted as selfish instead of self-preservation? Because you are correct. We are raised in a very individualistic society where we value independence and pull yourself up by your bootstraps, etc., rather than connection and collaboration. So a lot of our dads, uncles, male labeled, they feel like their job is to take care of everyone else. Who's taking care of me? Can I admit that I feel powerless, afraid? I mean, at some point, I feel like it makes sense to get burned out from always being the caretaker, the defender, and not being able for us to normalize that it's okay for you to create that space for yourself where, I think you were saying earlier, we've feminized vulnerability.
Yeah, and when I wrote the book, I really wanted to make it as accessible as possible. That people do have busy lives; they haven't got time to read a whole book on just one aspect. So I was trying to cram in as many different things in a kind of a brief intro way, because I knew that people, well, from talking to people, to clients in sessions, things that I've assumed everyone knew about were brand new. We were sitting there like a 40, 50-year-old going, what is this concept of self-compassion? What do you mean by that?
Mm. Yes, that really resonates for me, because dealing with some clients that are 40, 50, 60, it really is shocking to them when you start to describe this and help them to understand it. It's brand new in many, many ways. And even that is a new experience, because particularly in our culture, a 50-year-old guy, like, we have it together. Like, we've sort of done this, we've got our resume together, and it looks like we've got it together. I mean, that certainly in quotes, but to have that experience of a brand new concept coming at you, that's extremely emotionally driven and psychological, can unto itself be really challenging.
So I got a bit lost in metaphors when I was doing the book, and because the reason was to make it, as easy to understand as possible. Yeah. So, like these self words, I decided to create a shelter of resilience. So 4 walls of a shelter of resilience. So one of the walls is self-esteem, another is self-compassion, another is self-care, another is self-awareness through acceptance. And I kind of just had that kind of theme of survival, like the survival guide. We are all out in the wilderness of life, and sometimes we need to rest, and that shelter of resilience can protect us. We don't necessarily need to do very much to maintain it. There's a lot of little tricks we can do, but it's essential now and again. And then the kind of survival tools, things like unhelpful thought patterns, I called our headgear. The emotions was the flashlight of emotions. That's why there's a flashlight on the cover. And then we had the action pack, the kind of behavior that we can do to help or hinder ourselves. So I was really trying to think of a way that would appeal to the male labeled, with also holding an awareness that is a very wide group. So that's why we go back to beyond the blue. It's not just the male group. Male labeled is not just the opposite of the female. There are multicolors and multi-identities, including people who don't identify with that male label at all. So just trying to be as inclusive as possible in the book. So it wasn't just another book for men and who kind of are strong, and that which feeds the myth. But
Chris,
yeah.
I just, I want to go back to your shelter that you built, because I loved that metaphor. And the thing that really, another, male labeled, but also value system, especially, well, I can't just say in this country, the self-esteem wall, and how you pointed out that the materials that we use to build that wall are really what make the difference.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, not just fly by night temporary things, not sporting medals or the size of your house, but it goes to the core, and it's a long-term thing. It's not just this flash in the pan, one moment feeling good. Yeah, so it takes a lot of work, and the dreaded imposter can creep in sometimes and chip away at that self-esteem wall, trying to get in. But yeah, again, I'm always surprised at how these terms are brand new to some clients, and that's again why I thought we'll just put it in the book. Yeah. But knowing that that's not the be all and end all, I really want to make that message clear, that I know you guys understand that this is just the beginning of awareness, and that often with things like trauma particularly, they'll need a lot more help. And that's why I put a chapter about how to find the right kind of help. People who see beyond labels. That was another big part of this, that sometimes healthcare professionals can just see the male label, but also they can also just only see the diagnostic label and they get rigid. And I just wanted to challenge that a little, that I think we're all in agreement that these are kind of more fluid concepts than people appreciate. There is not a dividing line. You're depressed or you're not depressed, or you have PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and you don't. It's very nuanced. So that was another thing I wanted to make clear in the book, that when you're seeking the right type of professional help, try to find someone who is willing to get to know you, the unique you, beyond the blue of your mail label and beyond diagnostic labels.
And the behaviors, right? Because can we talk a little more about the black swan? Because the white swan, the way we're trained, is looks, stays in their room, doesn't want to engage with friends. Can we talk more about that? Is just one, that's just one view of what depression looks like.
Yeah, shall I do you want me to read the depression introduction? Yeah, so in each chapter of my book, so I deal with depression in one chapter, anxiety in another, relationship conflict and anger in another, and then trauma in another. And for each of those mental health challenges, I first of all say generally the symptoms that you should look out for. So in this case, depression, and then how it impacts the mail label, and then the kind of help you can get. So this is chapter 2, the beginning of the depression chapter, where I'm trying to help people understand the symptoms of depression. There is a beast that dwells in the shadows of all of us. If it were to approach, you would not notice until it landed heavily on your shoulders, until it dragged you down with a solid sense of hopelessness. By the time you feel this weight, it is too late to escape. Your energy, your enthusiasm, and your sense of direction are already being devoured from within. Enter the beast. The beast of depression is multifaceted and a changeling because it adopts many different forms for different people. For some, the beast might appear in the form of elongated tears or pining and longing, while others experience short, intense bursts of anger and irritability. Problems arise when people expect the tears but miss the other signs. Can you recognize the multifaceted beast of depression in any of these guises? The oversleeping fatigue of an excessive bed dweller, the stooped head of an overworker, the dead-eyed smile of the dark-hearted laugher, the gorging mess of an overeater, the dried-up sterility of an undereater, the fire and flash of the explosive aggressor, the wane and drain of the persistently negative thinker, the deadpan indifference of the flat, numbed-out non-feeler, the ache, pain, and throb to the head, stomach, and joints of the somaticizer, the cut and burn of the self-harmer, the hopelessness of the suicidal, the disappearing act of the isolator. In the grip of the beast, life seems pointless or uninteresting, or you snap at your loved ones, or you know the right things to do to improve your life, yet you have zero motivation to attempt any of them. You feel tearful and sad. You cannot remember the last time you easily fell asleep. You have about as much energy as a drained battery. You tell yourself you are a failure, which is proven when you cannot concentrate on a conversation with your partner. You are restless, or you have dark thoughts of hurting yourself, or you buy stupid things, hoping they will change you, how you feel, but you cannot be bothered to get that damn Peloton out of the box, let alone read the instruction manual. The author, Margaret Atwood, called it the sluggish wave. It was Winston Churchill's black dog, and some have referred to it as a wet rubber blanket. No matter the name, its presence is undoubtedly felt. So that's depression. Do you have anything to throw in to add to that?
I love your analogies, by the way. I think they really are helpful to literally describe, you spoke earlier about how we don't in our culture particularly don't have a language. We don't understand. And I reflect a lot when we're in our work about how can we change that from a macro point of view, right? I'm doing this now in the session, and that's wonderful and productive and helpful. But what's the macro answer to the 50-year-old sitting in my office or 40-year-old sitting in my office? How can we meaning every single person on this Zoom, by the way, in every one of the segments of our life, start to talk about these things in a way where it's less scary and the language starts to not be so out there, right? And so strange.
Sure.
Thoughts on
And
that?
a lot of some of my clients, they do use kind of caricature names for not just their depression, but their anxiety or the symptoms from their trauma. And it's not minimizing it, it's sort of putting it in a way that they can incorporate in their lives and not let it sort of be so scary in the closet thing that they don't want to look at. So yeah.
Depression too, in particular, I mean, obviously we all have an interest in folks making their way to proverbially our offices, whoever office it would be, sooner, right? Rather than when the fire is a little bit small, when there's a little bit of moodiness, when there's a little bit of disruption. And here, I reflect a lot on what you talk about in your book, which is sort of those barriers. Like what are those barriers? That's what I really worry about. I worry about what can we do to bring those barriers down, to get folks in sooner. There's all kinds of reasons, most notably the humanness of it. The sooner folks can come in, the better.
Sure. And also, it is to create a healthier society for everybody, no matter their label. It's not just a self-help guide for the male labeled, because undiagnosed depression, anxiety, trauma in a society makes the whole society unhealthy. We have people driving like dangerously, or taking drugs, or drinking alcohol, and not getting the help that they need. So it's within everybody's interest for this to change.
Yeah, I think of it as a public health issue, largely. There's a and I'll say who it is, Josh Gottheimer, who I see all the time out there in the world. And every time I see him, my one phrase to him is always, Josh, remember, mental health is your largest public health issue. To a point where now he says, hi, Mike, I know mental health is the largest public health issue. But I will not see him even once where I won't say that, for this reason, for exactly what we're talking about. This is a policy issue. This is a school issue. This is a family issue. This is your kitchen table. This is your desk at the classroom. This is Sunday at a Westside Presbyterian. And so, we all have both our responsibility and our working together, which there's a lot of power here in this case. There's 34 people here that are here to reflect on this and listen. This is a serious conversation that could have just tremendous impact, tremendous.
And I think it was already a problem before the pandemic. I think the pandemic's only made things worse in terms of access to adequate mental health care. And that's the key word.
Very much agree.
Would you like me to read another extract?
Sure.
Or is that enough?
No, go right ahead.
No? Okay. So I mentioned about the shelter of resilience. So this is one of the walls, which is the wall of self-compassion. During my years as a psychotherapist, I've helped the male labeled build and maintain their shelter of resilience to reduce the impact of depression, anxiety, relationship conflict, and trauma. In all those years, the wall of self-compassion has been the hardest to construct. Too often, what is erected is so lopsided that it quickly falls apart. The compassion that they have for their children, partner, friends, or even work colleagues stands tall and strong like a towering brick wall of strength and support. And yet their self-compassion is small and paper thin to the point of translucence. So what is self-compassion? It's when you are kind to yourself, when you see suffering and you want it to end. You know that we are all human and you recognize that mistakes can be made. You understand rather than criticize or punish. You adopt a mindful, balanced approach to life. These are all the hallmarks of compassion, and it can be applied to yourself as much as it can be applied to other people. A titanium strong wall of self-compassion can be created by the same words you use for other people. Kind words of understanding and acceptance that come so easily when you are referring to someone else, but come so hard when you try to apply them to yourself. Why do you find it easier to offer compassion to other people? You deserve as much understanding and acceptance as the next person. Find your strong, kind voice of self-compassion and start to practice it today. I also wanted to just throw in just a little bit of science, because maybe that might appeal to the male-labeled reader a bit more. They're not interested in these faddy words like self-compassion, but when they hear scientists say, so I said, according to neuroscientists, that always gets my clients' ears pricked up when I say that, certain clients. Self-compassion triggers the release of oxytocin, a hormone that produces a calming effect. Oxytocin has been linked to close connection, and it is released during sex, childbirth, and even when we play with our pets, children, or we just become childlike and playful again. So why wouldn't you want to get some more of this good stuff? So that's self-compassion. Do you have any comments on that?
Beautiful.
More of the same.
Love it. Beautiful analogy. Love it. And you're so correct on how well, and we all do this. But most of us, I'm guessing, they're here tonight, and we're here for lots of reasons. We're so compassionate with others, right? We're cooking in the kitchens, and we're raising money for what we're raising money for, and we're doing soup kitchens, we're doing everything. And when it comes to ourselves, it's very interesting to reflect on, where do we each fall on that list? Are we number 5, 4, 7, 10? In terms of our own self compassion. Beautiful analogy, and an important one. Absolutely.
And I think it starts young, that we're taught to focus outwards at others and forget about this stuff, just kind of go on looking outwards, and that can get quite tricky, I think.
That's a question I use with a lot of, the kids that I work with, when they're, we do that, what does your mean voice look like? And what does your kind voice look like? And would you, when they say some awful things to themselves, and I say, would you say that to your friend? So I think starting there, to just open up that idea of, if you can be that kind to your friend, then can you create a little bit of space for yourself and be kind to yourself? It starts at a very early age.
And then we get into, maybe sometimes they've been given unhelpful messages from their upbringing. If we think about adverse childhood experiences, that our self-compassion could be rotten from quite an early age, if we're around the wrong type of people who raise us. So that can be often the deeper part of the work.
Sandy, I love your analogy, because I love the fact that you work with children. In my mind, I think sort of systemically, it's upstream, right? So I'm not sitting with a 40-year-old who's struggling and who's wondering why the third marriage hasn't worked out, and why they're not quite as successful at work as they hoped. I think of your work as very much upstream, and thinking like, we've got a chance here. If we can sort of work with that age and younger, and sort of teach some skills in very much the way that Chris's book is articulating for us, we've got a shot. And so go, Sandy, I say. Please.
Well, and I will also say that I have had some dads that have come in and said that bringing this little bundle home from the hospital, they were like, it just starts to, like Chris said, adverse childhood experience. It starts to trigger some things, and then they start to reach out and recognize that they want to parent in a different way. So bravo. I don't
think
know how.
I think the trauma piece was the most difficult part of this, and probably that's why subconsciously I left it to the end of the book, the last chapter, because you can't deal with it with a self-help book. But I wanted people to understand that sometimes what you're feeling, if you're detached, if you're blank-minded, if you have memory loss, if you feel disconnected from others, that might be trauma. That might be a sign that stuff has gone on that you need to unpack a little. And so that I just wanted to kind of, again, it was all about awareness raising, that people who may not ever think about coming to us therapists, just starting to think about, oh, maybe that's not right. Maybe because often with childhood trauma, especially if you're in your 50s, 60s, you think, oh, well, that was just the norm. That was just what was done, and what's past is past. But they don't realize how much triggers can impact their current life. Like, oh, why aren't I sustaining a close relationship with anyone? Why am I having these rages at work? It must be something about my coworkers. So I had to tread really carefully with that chapter, because there is no quick fix, unfortunately.
There isn't. And so those early experiences, really our core, they form our core beliefs, and that's how we're operating in the current world unless we're doing this work. But Chris, it's a catalyst for, I think, people who, let's say I have women who come in and say that their husbands, boyfriends, fiancés, brothers, they know there's an issue, but they're having a really, but they refuse to go to therapy. This is
a starting point.
It's a good starting point and primer on what it looks like, because it doesn't always look like the obvious that, you describe as the white swan. Sometimes it's that the workaholic, perfectionist, right?
Many, many years ago, back in 2011, I lost my mom and dad 10 months apart. I went into this depression. I started eating. I couldn't stop eating. For some strange reason, I depended on food. And I couldn't accept the death. I started off as very bitter. I cried all day, went into bitterness. I'm trying to remember what else I did. Just not my normal self. Is that normal when you lose somebody?
Well, without knowing the whole context, I couldn't say what's normal and what's not normal. I don't think there's any such thing as normal. So I wouldn't want to answer that question. Sandy or Mike, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, it's a tough one, of course, so individual, but absolutely, we all cope in different ways. Everyone copes in different ways with in different situations, and I think, and I think, Chris, you aptly described maybe even just trying to not use the word normal or not normal while you think about the process, and just know that it sounds like you did the best you can, and here you are tonight. So you can.
I always like the phrase helpful, unhelpful. And I mean, that kind of segues into going back to resisting labels, because people come in and go, oh my gosh, I've been told I'm this label diagnosis. And then we look at, okay, let's just break this down into what's impacting your life, short-term and long-term, what's unhelpful and helpful for you right now and for the future. Not normal, not what's this label, what's other people saying about it.
Yeah, that's so true. I mean, my first job out of graduate school was in foster care, and talk about being labeling trauma as behavior, and yeah.
Yeah, certainly.
I always like that volcano analogy, where you kind of see the lava at the top, but you don't know what the underlying needs are that are kind of creating that lava that you're seeing. Always got to know what's going on underneath.
Yeah.
But I think that's the beauty of the book, actually, because it provides the context for a conversation, and it provides the context for us to be having not just this conversation here, but in more of a macro level. It provides just additional education and information to be out there, and I think it could just really have some baby steps. We have a phrase at Westbergen where baby steps all together make a life. It's very rare that you have these big leaps forward. It tends to be kind of small steps, and it's just a big help, I think, in terms of the overall process. And I'm noticing in the Q&A here, just for a second, Bill, I see your question in terms of the public health and elected officials. I think it's all part of the same, my opinion, I think it's all part of the same question. I think we feel a little scared by it, right? We're a little scared by mental health. And so we don't adequately talk about it. That's why we're having this conversation tonight. It's why Chris wrote a book. And then that absolutely translates into social policy, which translates into prioritization, which translates into dollars, which translates into investment. And so it's and that's why I guess what I'm reflecting on is it's not just about the client that I saw at 6 tonight. It's really about the bigger picture in the conversation. And it's a big one. And I do think that COVID has helped. I think that COVID has really helped. I think it's been the great equalizer in many ways, in terms of us all agreeing that mental health is important. I think that it tees up, no coincidence, Chris, that you wrote the book at this time. I think that it tees it up very nicely.
Yeah.
So.
And I mean, I just wanted to kind of just go back over a couple of key messages I mentioned at the beginning. That, I mean, first of all, the whole point of the name of the book, Beyond the Blue, starting with beyond the blue of the male label. We can't just look at people in terms of binary opposites according to their sex label from birth, because they may not identify with that sex label. They may be genderqueer or non-binary. So we need to look beyond the blue of that male sex label, especially because that label often acts as an obstacle to us and understanding the whole of that person in terms of mental health. It impacts on how the person who's struggling views their emotions. Sometimes they don't even know what's going on. And then it impacts on how they seek help. But then it also impacts on how the healthcare professional views that person. Sometimes that male label is like a blindfold over the healthcare professional, and they just see the male, and then they have all these associations with it. And that's the one obstacle, the male label. And then on top of that, the other parts of their identity may cause additional obstacles, things like transphobia, racism on behalf of the healthcare professionals means people don't get the help that they need. And then on top of that, the pandemic came and it just added more kind of stress to the fractures of inaccessible mental health care. So I wanted to give to the people who are least likely to be accessing mental health care, in my opinion, and the most likely to be survivors of trauma and suicide, some tools, survival tools, for them to know, am I suffering from depression or anxiety or trauma? And how much so am I prevented from getting the right type of help? Is my healthcare professional just seeing a male label rather than me? And then thirdly, what can I do about it? There's little survival tools that I can use, my thought patterns, emotion regulation, behavior that I can do or not do. And then finally, how can I get the right type of professional help? There's a chapter on that as well. So talk to, if you are male labeled, think about what's going on for you. Have a look in the book. Are there any of the symptoms that resonate with you? It may be depression, trauma. If so, get the right type of help. If you love or work with or live with male label people, check in on them, because the way society is set up, you might have that black swan in your household who is suffering from depression or trauma and you just haven't noticed it because of the way we condition people with the male label.
Thanks so much, Chris. Well done.
No
well
problem.
done piece and a well done conversation.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you
you for
so
asking me
very much.
along.
Yeah, really, thank you so much. And I also just really highlight we have a couple of professionals on here who are working with children, working with others. And I think that everything that you've laid out also helps those who are working with people to maybe not turn to pragmatics, but to look at the emotional problem beneath what seems to present as kind of like a practical, behavioral thing. And sometimes we just need extra confidence to do that as professionals. So I appreciate and commend your work in that area as well. So both for self-diagnosis and for those of us who are working with just numerous people at numerous age levels. So thank you so much for all of your time. You guys are really just the best of Bergen County in the mental health world, along with so many others that have been here. And you have been on the front lines, really working so hard. And we truly, truly appreciate it. And thank you for just taking extra time out of your busy schedules to be with us this evening. So friends,
Thank you again for inviting me.
Thank you. I've put in the chat ways to get in touch with Chris and his work. And as you heard from everybody, they're local. We know how to get in touch with West Bergen Mental Health. It is just part of our wish that you go from this space and that you be well. We hope to see you next week. We will be in person in our sanctuary with a special practice that will involve yoga and a lot of lovely, relaxing things. So we hope that you will join us. Be well, friends.
Good night, all.
Thank you.
Good night.